40 years ago, in his inauguration address, a new U.S. president announced a radical turn. Out with the New Deal of the 1930s and the war on poverty of the 1960s. In with the era of lower taxes and light touch regulation.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Last week in Pittsburgh, a new U.S. president announced a radical turn the other way. Out with the Reagan revolution, in with a $2.3 trillion infrastructure plan designed to create jobs in a post-pandemic world, also reduce inequality and discrimination, and restore America's status as the world's undisputed superpower with incentives to innovate and go green. Will Joe Biden's gamble pay off? The same lawmakers who, by a razor-thin margin, just approved his $1.9 trillion stimulus plan still need to sign off on what would be a decade's worth of spending on everything from rebuilding crumbling roads and bridges to affordable housing and renewable energy. Can the U.S. afford to do it? Can the U.S. afford not to do it? With the U.S. recovery already out of the starting blocks with a bang and China emerging even sooner from COVID, what's Europe's answer to this kind of state-sponsored capitalism, which once seemed the exclusive trademark of this continent? What world order after the pandemic? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the Biden revolution. With us, Jeremy Guez. He's professor of international affairs and economics at the French Business School HEC. Thanks for being with us. Welcome back to the show. From Chicago, Randall Krosner is deputy dean at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, former member of the Board of Governors of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And from Baltimore, Maryland, Kristen Baya, Programs Director on Climate Resilience at the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. If I understand correctly, you're an organization that works with local governments.
That's correct. 240 local governments in North America. Thanks so much for having me.
Welcome to the show. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, after Joe Biden's unveiling near Pittsburgh last week of his American Jobs Plan, it's now about selling it, what he has touted as the biggest such scheme since World War II, with an eye, he says, to hiring people who don't have a college degree.
It's a blue-collar blueprint for increasing the opportunity for people. This is an economic opportunity for those who've helped build the country and have been ignored or neglected for much too long by our government. It's a once-in-a-generation investment in our economic future, a chance to win the future, paid for by asking big corporations, many of which do not pay any taxes at all, just to begin to pay their fair share. And it won't raise a penny tax on a family making less than $400,000 a year. No federal tax.
Kristen Baya, we have on this very set for a decade now been talking about things like the Tea Party. Is that all like past now? This is a very different America?
Well, the United States is changing, but change is always slow. I think we're heading in the right direction. Certainly the Biden administration is putting us on the road to a better direction. We see this plan incorporating lots of different elements of infrastructure. So getting beyond just our traditional idea of infrastructure and moving into social infrastructure, which I think is going to be critically important to the success of this country.
Yeah, the definition of infrastructure is large. When you look at what's actually in the plan, we can call up a graphic, and top of that list is home community care. That's to say, funding assistance for the elderly and the disabled. Jeremy Guez, when you look at that graph, let's look at it, study it a second here. We see that actually roads and bridges is number 4 on the list. So it's an infrastructure plan, but it's not infrastructure as Kristen says, the way we think of it in traditional terms. Your thoughts at the breakdown of this spending?
To me, it's a roadmap to transform America. When you're looking at this, it's, of course, what you would traditionally think of infrastructure, roads and bridges, mobility, trying to think about broadband, transit, and so on. But there's also this notion of saying this has to change the life of everyday Americans. This has to change the life of middle classes that have been, to some extent, the forgotten of globalization, that have been to some extent out of this debate for a little while, and that invited themselves back in 2016. You think of three big states like Wisconsin, big in terms of decisive, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. They decided the elections in 2016. They decided the elections in 2020. This is a way of Joe Biden to say, we're probably not going to find some middle ground politically. We might find some middle ground economically. And you might remember, we all remember the saying, it's the economy, stupid. Well, it seems like it's back on the table.
It's back on the table. However, and I'll put it to you, Randall Krosner, when you think back, and you just heard the list of those three states that swung the election for Donald Trump back in 2016. You think back 40 years ago, there was that term Reagan Democrats, blue-collar workers who voted for Republicans. What's different this time around, and do you agree that it's a transformative moment for the United States?
Well, it certainly is potentially transformative because we've never seen fiscal expenditure on this scale before, with $3 trillion being spent last year, $2 trillion being spent now, and then another $2 to $3 trillion promised for spending. That's an enormous increase in the share of government relative to economic activity, and an enormous increase in the debt burden on future generations. The key is, will this be spent wisely that will actually be helpful to individual households and helpful to the economy overall? I think it's still at a very general level to see whether this will have the payoffs that we could hope that it would have. But I think it really behooves us to be very, very careful, because this has to be paid for. And you can't get all these things for free. I think it is very important to make sure that average Americans are not left behind. But the key is, what sort of opportunities are best for them? What is the best way to invest in them? Perhaps one of the key ways to invest in them is making sure they have excellent job opportunities. One of the ways to do that is to make sure that they have good educational backgrounds. That doesn't seem to have gotten as much focus here. There is a discussion of sort of care homes and such. There's some discussion of school construction. But what about making sure that people have the skills necessary for them to be successful in the labor market and successful in these other broader social areas?
Now, there is money earmarked, for instance, for things like community colleges. So there is a bit of what you say, education in there, Randall. Again, that original premise that government is the problem that Ronald Reagan said 40 years ago is now dead and turned on its head by Joe Biden. Do you agree with Jeremy that the American public could perhaps go along with that?
I'm sure there's certainly large swaths of the American public that are supportive of that. I'm not sure that everyone is. I think there's still a lot of people who are very concerned about the role of government in U.S. society. I think there are more people who are willing to be open to consider that, but there are many people who feel that the government has not done such a good job, for example, with the pandemic and pandemic response. I think they're wary of putting more faith in government to get things right. I think they're wary of the data and information that they have been given, and data information that is being collected on them. So I think there's still a deep wariness of the government in the U.S. I think there is a chance that Joe Biden could try to convince people otherwise, but I think it's a real uphill battle. I don't think it's just going to be like this.
All right, we're gonna get back to that issue of how you pay for it in a moment. But first, let's talk about the cost of not fixing it. Dateline, Weehawken, New Jersey, that's right outside of New York City. A 120-year-old train tunnel that, when it breaks down, disrupts rail traffic up and down the East Coast.
Water infiltration that comes in on the crown of the tunnel, it'll freeze, it'll become an icicle, and then those icicles will fall down onto the 12,000 volts of the catenary.
Again, so that's something that happens all the time. Jeremy Giz, we are all complaining here in France. We had a fatal crash in the suburbs of Paris a few years back,
Right.
because a catener hadn't been properly dealt with. So infrastructure, it's an issue everywhere. In the U.S., though, it seems more acute.
It's an interesting debate. I mean, when you look at it, the question is this worthy of a world superpower, let alone the first power in the world? And I think this debate is an old one. You might remember the speech in 2012 given by Barack Obama. You didn't build that. He was implicitly talking about Mitt Romney, telling him, you might think you're a billionaire and you might think that you basically succeeded in doing so many things. But then again, you didn't build that. So stop taking credit for things that basically were the result more of a collective effort. Mentions the teacher, he mentions the roads and bridges and so on and so forth. And you have, of course, Republicans who rightfully so point to the importance of individual incentive. I think that the infrastructure issue, interestingly enough, has always been in the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration, one of the areas where there's a potential overlap of interest between Republicans and Democrats. It has always been presented as the key issue where there might be bipartisan agreement. Here today, there's a generic view, in my opinion, that a consensual view that if you do not fix this, it's not going to work. Economically speaking, it's not going to work. And you're going to need, of course, a lot of individual incentives, but you're going to need an ecosystem that is favorable to innovation, favorable to changing, and favorable to developing all of these things that are going to let the United States continue to compete with China.
Kristen Baya, you're in Baltimore, a city that still bears the scars of the riots of the 1960s. And I want to ask you, how do you fix Baltimore? Because that would be, I guess that would be a whole hour we could devote just to that one question. But your thoughts on how you go about this, though?
Yeah, I think it's the way we structure this. And so the idea that we even need to fix Baltimore, I think it's actually looking at the fact that we are part of systems and interconnected systems, and that we all need to be coming together to realize that this isn't just about hard infrastructure. It's not just about fixing a tunnel or fixing a bridge. I think it was mentioned before, we have to think about education. We have to think about workforce development. We also have to be thinking about putting humans first. And there's a real need to get into the reality of the history of this country and where we're prioritizing our dollars and how we're thinking about humans and their human needs and prioritizing the systems that serve them. So I think the thing that's beneficial about this infrastructure bill is that we have the intersectionality of social, ecological, and traditional infrastructure coming together that allows us to be more innovative. It allows us to get ahead of things, and it allows us to think about reparations as part of the process, which I think is an important component of all of this work.
What do you mean by reparations?
Acknowledging that this country, especially the United States, was built for one user group. It was built for white male landowners. And so we have been creating inequities in this country and making sure that we had sacrifice zones or exclusionary zoning or opportunities for only white people for long periods of time. Now we're not starting from an even playing field. We have 400 years of inequity built into these systems, into the economy. And we have to be thinking about reparations as part of our infrastructure work, as part of prioritizing the areas that we're going to invest in.
Okay, Kristen, let me ask a political question then, because the first stimulus package of Biden, the 1.9 trillion one, that meant checks in everybody's pockets, whether they were minorities or not. And a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump felt as though they're disenfranchised and that somehow minorities are getting too much attention. This idea of reparations, will it make it a harder sell for Joe Biden if that's the path he pursues?
I think that this is a really politically divided country. And certainly we're not seeing the idea of putting people's needs and thinking about our systems and our whole ecosystem together. We're instead creating these divides around what we have had and what we're hoping to get to. There's a lot of fear, and a lot of fear in politics, and a lot of fear of people who are losing positionality or losing power they didn't actually get or earn. It was done based on their skin color. So I think it will be a harder sell. This is all going to be a hard sell, but do I think it's absolutely necessary? It's entirely necessary. It's what we need to start doing. It's the shift that needs to happen. It's the transformation that needs to be part of this bill.
Randall Krosner, do you agree?
So I think that there are a lot of concerns, a lot of divisiveness in the U.S., and I think that is an enormous challenge. One of the things that I think has made people feel disenfranchised is a lack of opportunity, feeling that the system is not in their favor, is rigged for particular subgroups or for particular other groups. And that's why I think a very important part of the infrastructure is making sure that we look not only at spending in particular areas, but also our regulatory infrastructure, our education infrastructure, as we had spoken about, to make sure that people have opportunities to be able to get ahead. When people are discouraged and they can't get ahead or feel that they can't, or the system is biased for others, that is really problematic. And unfortunately, many of our laws and regulations have not been level playing field, but have tilted things towards one group or another. And so I think it's extremely important to try to encourage innovation, encourage people to become entrepreneurial, encourage people to be able to take advantage of all the great things that America has to offer, and not see that there are barriers to that. And I think there have been a lot of barriers in regulation in our infrastructure that have been problematic, not in the traditional infrastructure sense of bridges and roads, but in terms of regulation and opportunity.
What do you mean by regulation? Do you mean that the regulation is skewed towards interest groups, or that regulation prevents people from achieving their potential?
Both, actually. And so you have some things like a standard thing that both the Republicans and Democrats have railed against, but have not made a lot of progress on, is state licensing regulations for a whole series of different types of activities, of people to be working in different areas, whether it's in healthcare or whether it's in beauty areas or other areas. So there's a whole variety of things that made it very difficult for people to move across state lines and be able to do what they want to do. And so trying to address that would be valuable. We also have regulations that, and those existing rules help to help the incumbents, help the interest groups of the people who are already there, because they don't like new people coming in and competing with them. We need to eliminate those barriers to competition, to allow new people to come in to compete. We also have regulations that make it more difficult for entrepreneurs to be able to do investment, to move ahead. This also will get to our discussion on how we finance these expenditures, because if you have burdens that make it difficult for people to become entrepreneurs, if you have things that slow the economy down, that also reduces the opportunity for people to innovate and get ahead.
All right, let's pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at what's been described as a paradigm shift for the United States. What with Joe Biden announcing a huge infrastructure plan, $2.3 trillion over 8 years. The idea is to invest in infrastructure while tackling issues like inequality, going green, the digital transformation. We're talking about it with Jeremy Guez, professor of international affairs and economics at the prestigious Paris Business School, HEC. Welcome back as well to Randall Krosner, deputy dean at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business and a former member of the Board of Governors of the U.S. Federal Reserve. And from Baltimore, Maryland, Kristen Baya, who is programs director on climate resilience at the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. Yeah, $2.3 trillion over 8 years. Too little or too much? It depends which lawmaker you ask.
If we actually want, in good faith, to make this vision and the commitments that they've put down happen, we need a more robust investment. I have real serious concerns that 2.25 trillion over 8 years is not going to get us there.
I think that's a big mistake. And I think that package that they're putting together now, as much as we would like to address infrastructure, is not going to get support from our side, because I think what the last thing the economy needs right now is a big whopping tax increase on all the productive sectors.
Jeremy Gez, your reaction to those remarks there?
Look, if you try to go just beyond the political rhetoric of all of this, it's true that we know that ecological transition is going to cost a lot of money. One report came out saying it's going to be $1 trillion a year over 10 years. So indeed, by that measure, 2.3 trillion is not enough. But 1 trillion over 10 years per year over, that doesn't really stand the real reality test when you look at what Congress is ready to put. And I think that no matter how you look at this, people agreed that the effort is going to be humongous. Roy Blunt yesterday morning, told one of your colleagues on the Sunday shows, I'd be ready to settle for 30% of the amount. 30% is $600 billion. It's very close to what the U.S. spent as a total in response to the 2009 crisis. It was $787 billion, the Obama package at the time. So I think that many people have recognized the nature of the challenge ahead of us. In the wake of what happened in Texas last month, in the wake of when you look,
where the electricity grid, because of a cold snap,
exactly
went bust.
Exactly. In the wake of, as an American in Paris, I'm always in awe at how fast my cell phone connection works. You go to the U.S., you don't have that. That's in the wake of all of the debates related to the healthcare system. People agree on the nature of the challenge. I think there's a lot of political rhetoric and a lot of grandstanding around it. But this is the place where the United States is going to have to find an agreement on trying to transform this country and, again, meeting some challenges. I agree with the entrepreneurial side to it, but not in this ecosystem.
Right. Kristen Baya, how do you pay for an ambitious ecological transformation? Things like power stations, right, for electric vehicles, things like solar panels, wind farms to wean the U.S. off of fossil fuels, and much more. How do you pay for it?
Well, I'm going to be honest, I'm not the economist on the group here. I do think that deregulation is what got us into the mess we're currently in, and certainly that we need to be not providing tax breaks for the companies that use all this infrastructure. For example, Amazon isn't paying taxes, yet they're using the majority of the infrastructure. They're one of the biggest companies in this world. And so I think that the proposal to pay for it of increasing taxes on corporations and thinking about that component is really, really critical. I agree with it. I also think, though, that the way we provide the funding needs to change. We need to prioritize the funding coming directly to local government-led processes and to include the inclusivity, to include the flexibility, to have more adaptability in the plans. Even if we throw a bunch of money at it, if the process itself is not working in a way that we can get the work done, then we're just throwing money. So I think it actually has to be a process change in addition to identifying how we're paying for it. And both of those things need to be looked at together.
Need to be looked at together. The big sticking point, and we heard the Senate Minority Leader speaking, he's not happy with the lowering of the corporate tax, the raising rather, which Donald Trump lowered to 21%, up to 28%, which is what Joe Biden is suggesting. Randall Krosner, that's nonetheless coupled with talks that are underway to have a global conversation. Here at the OECD in Paris, they're having one on how you change the taxation system worldwide and stop what Biden calls a race to the bottom when it comes to taxing corporations like the one that Kristen just mentioned, Amazon, which doesn't pay for the services it gets.
As Christian made a very important point about you don't want to just throw money at a problem. You want to make sure that you're solving a problem. And there are different ways to solve a problem, and sometimes just throwing more money at it isn't the most effective way. And so it's very important to think about what is it that is needed in the U.S. to unleash the productive potential in the U.S., to make individuals and households realize their highest values and their purposes of what they want. And we have to be very careful about disincentives that come in through a tax system that could lead people to say, hey, I don't want to invest in the US, I want to invest abroad, or in the reforms that occurred a few years ago, billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars, were kept offshore because of the way the tax system was set up. And there was a very strong disincentive to bring that money back to the US for private sector investment in the US, which creates jobs, creates opportunities for people to get ahead, creates opportunities for entrepreneurs. And so that's extremely important to make sure to think about that piece of it. And that's exactly what Janet Yellen was getting at in her discussion today about thinking about global tax competition. One of the reasons why the US lowered its corporate tax rate is because it had not done so for decades. The rest of the world had brought all their tax rates down. And so if you have lower tax rates elsewhere and you have very high tax rates in the US, you're not going to get the US investment, you're not going to get the growth, you're not going to get the opportunities.
We don't have 21% corporate tax here in France, do we, Jeremy?
No, we don't. We don't, and the 21% is a historical low in the United States too. Even 28% by many accounts would still be a low point, historically speaking. Look, I'm very sensitive to all of these points, and I think they're very, very important. And I'm also all ears when it comes to not throwing exclusively money at a problem. This is what you do when you have a fire, and now the fire has more or less been extinguished in the United States. What's important, I think, to me right now is basically the ability to build, again, a better ecosystem. And this is, I think, what this Biden administration is trying to do.
Can you stop this race to the bottom on taxation? Is there a way to do it globally?
I think there's a lot of goodwill to do that. I think this is the right administration to do this. I think that there's also, they have a strategic asset, negotiation asset, the Joe Biden administration, in the sense that they can say, look what was just before us. There's no way of telling what might come right after us. So you better get this deal with us because we're the reasonable ones in the U.S. political room right now. And I think this could be a real asset in this arm wrestling match within the OECD.
Because just to make it clear for our viewers, the current tax rules for the global economy, they were written, decades ago, even a century ago in some cases.
Yeah, and I think that there's always been this temptation anyway of the race to the bottom, but I think it doesn't really meet the test of basically talking about the type of societies we want. We talked about Trump voters in the United States. We can talk about Brexit in the UK. We can talk about yellow vests in France. There's a lot of importance attached to basically, again, it is not even the welfare state. It's basically what these societies can create in terms of opportunities. This is language I agree with, but this is not just plain about individual incentives. You have to have a better ecosystem, one that provides the ability and the opportunity to everyone.
All right. You mentioned how the fire is over in the United States while France shuts down for another 4 weeks while we wait on vaccines here. Delta Airlines last week announcing it's to stop blocking the middle aisle of its seats on its planes starting on May the 1st. This as the UK's just set out a tentative date of May 17th to relaunch foreign travel, and the pubs are going to reopen next month. I'm rubbing it in, aren't I, Jeremy?
It hurts.
At this point in time, the head start the Americans got by effectively acting like socialists, right? When it came to the vaccination drive, while we were bargaining over the price. Mm-hmm. Will those few weeks matter in the end if we catch up?
If we catch up, I guess maybe it might just be a bad recollection. The problem is, will we be able to catch up? I am not a doctor, not in medicine, that is. But the problem is that the way I understand it is all of those variants, to what extent will they basically have a head start on us in Europe? And that's kind of the big problem.
All right, there's the epidemiological question, the public health question, but there's also the economic question, which is what we're talking about here with our panel. And that is, if the U.S. is thinking big in terms of infrastructure, can Europe follow suit?
You're going to have to get a lot of people around the table. Namely Germans who are going through a political change of their own, which is all but certain. You're going to have to basically find a way of making Europe credible. Look at the Juncker plan. The Juncker plan was decisive, it was bold, but it was nowhere near what the Americans are spending. This is basically a real question in the ability of Europe to reinvent itself. I think we have a lot of assets in terms of creating an ecosystem based on a population that is very healthy, that is very well educated. But now it's kind of the opposite of the United States, I would claim, try to put in a room for opportunities and an entrepreneurial mindset. This is a change in software that is needed on the part of Europeans. It's not entirely clear to me that we have the leadership to impose that.
So we have a paradigm shift, Randall Krosner, taking place in the United States. You heard Jeremy Guez's doubts about whether Europe can also have a paradigm shift. If this infrastructure plan does get approved by lawmakers on Capitol Hill, is the U.S. set for a second wind to its superpower status, to its king of the world status, if you will?
Well, I'm not sure that we are going to have the paradigm shift. I said there's a possibility of that, and certainly the Biden administration wants to do that. We'll see. And I'm not sure that this particular bill is the way to drive that. But I think we all agree that the key is opportunity. The key is unleashing innovation and entrepreneurship. Europe has not been at the forefront of doing that. That doesn't mean that there's no role for government. Exactly as you had said, the US is ahead on the vaccines and the UK is ahead on the vaccines because they had a very proactive approach in the US through Operation Warp Speed of making advanced investments, of thinking in terms of insurance. This was in the order of tens of billions of dollars, which will have trillions of dollars of benefit for the economies. So that doesn't mean that there's no role for government. But you have to have the role of government be appropriate and make sure that it doesn't end up crushing that individual entrepreneurial spirit. Europe has just not been very successful at that. And I think they do need a revolution in Europe in order to do that. And I hope that the revolution in the US doesn't crush that spirit here.
Kristen Baya, when you look at where the US could be headed right now compared to Europe, your thoughts?
Well, I hope we actually get out of the mentality of being king of the world. There's this real opportunity, I think, to integrate humility into our processes and to think about integrating a different sort of respect into the approach. Being king of the world is, again, creating division. It's creating disconnection. It's creating this idea of us versus them. And if we can come together and think more collaboratively, think about coming to different opportunities of being more comprehensive, holistic, and really respecting each other and the systems that we rely on as part of the process, that's a real opportunity here. We still do not respect the fact that life has been on this planet for 3.8 billion years. And so to put that into perspective, if we're looking at 1 year equals 3.8 billion, humans have really only been here since December 31st at 11:30 p.m. We have a lot of things that we can learn, and to integrate that humility into our process, to integrate respect for each other, to get out of the idea of extraction. I think there is an opportunity for a huge change, but we have to get out of the idea of king of the world being the goal.
Yeah, but Kristen, again, this is how Joe Biden is selling this infrastructure plan. He's saying, look, if we don't do this innovation, this fourth industrial revolution, if we don't go green, the Chinese are going to have us for lunch.
Yeah, I think it's the way that most of our politicians put forth a lot of big plans is we need to compete. How do we as world How do we, right now, France, United States, China, start to think about coming together more collaboratively? How do we think about getting out of the competition approach and more of the way we're working holistically? We are damaging this planet beyond repair, and we are creating an extinction path for our species. So I think it's really critical to get out of this idea of who gets to the top first. And the way that we think about packaging these approaches is to say, let's think about people first, thinking about our human needs first, and reframing the process so that we can think more holistically.
This pandemic was coming at a time, Jeremy Ghez, when the whole planet was thinking about these ecological issues more and more, the Fridays for the Future. Those issues have kind of taken a bit of a back burner, obviously, with this black swan moment we've all been living through for more than a year now. But when you look ahead to next year's presidential election here in France, what Christian is talking about, how big is that going to loom?
It's hard to disagree with Kristen on that point and on the need for a real transformation on the way we do business, and probably way more than that. She was arguing on a way greater scale, but at the very least, the way we do business, especially considering the fact that, this is a question, very strategic question of sustainability, seen through the prism of practical. What can we sustain over time in terms of our presence on Earth? With regards to the way we look at this in France, I think that the French are extremely attached to this notion. This has been announced by their presidents for quite some time. We might remember Jacques Chirac's speech back in the early 2000s, "The planet is burning." That's what he said in that speech. And I think that, again, this is a setting in which there's a lot of room for cooperation. This is not a new Cold War, because I think the nature of the challenges that we're facing is going to force global powers, namely China, the US, and the European Union, to collaborate. And I think France has a leadership question.
Are you sure that that's what's ahead? Because we're seeing people saying in be it in the US, in China, or in Europe, saying we have to rethink supply chains after this pandemic. Are we headed towards a decoupling of this globalized economy as the way it was up to now?
It's certainly a scenario. It's certainly a possible scenario, especially under the pressure of political tensions that are basically pushing away some countries, especially the United States and China, further away from each other, meaning they might rely on supply chains that are increasingly dissimilar, rely on standards processes that are increasingly different, and that might mean globalization being fragmented, certainly. But I don't think it would necessarily undermine the potential for cooperation on those mind-boggling and global challenges like climate change.
Randall Krosner, on Kristen's point, if I could use the pandemic as a parable, we've all heard the phrase that if the whole planet isn't vaccinated, nobody is. Can the same be said then about making the economy go green? And in which case, can the planet come together, or is that just not in human nature?
Well, it's an enormous challenge because often where you stand is where you sit. That is, you have political constituencies in different countries that have different approaches and different interests, and those come through, whether it's in France or Germany or the UK or the US or in China. So we have to deal with those realities. But we also have to realize that there are interconnections between our countries, whether it's in terms of supply chains, whether it's in terms of financial markets, or in terms of these global climate challenges. The key is for someone to be a political entrepreneur and figure out how to get people to work for the common goal and find out where those common elements are to be able to move forward. I think we're still not quite there, and you can see from the rhetoric, whether it's in the US or in other countries, we're not there. But I think there's a gradual understanding that some of these things do need to be dealt with globally rather than just locally.
All right, and that'll be the final word. Unfortunately, we're running short on time. Randall Krosner, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Chicago. I want to thank Christian Baia for being with us from Baltimore. Jeremy Ghez, I want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.